Hello, everybody. I'm going to make a number of points over the next 10 minutes or so. Starting off with, given the title of the day is What Cost Food Security? What is food security? And starting off, it's a term that is widely misused, particularly in political discourse. Strictly speaking, food security means everybody at all times having access to a healthy diet, one that is nutritionally adequate to underpin a healthy life. And the all people at all times is normally interpreted to mean it has to be sustainably produced, because otherwise the children of today, by the time they're my sort of age, might not be able to get the food that they need if we degrade the environment. So that's the strict definition of food security. But it's typically also used in two other ways. One, in terms of, particularly when looking at the global south, food security in the sense of, do people have anything to eat and enough to keep them going on a day-to-day basis to stop starvation? And the other meaning, which is particularly the meaning in a lot of political discourse, is food security occurs when the shelves are full in supermarkets, and therefore food security is a property of the market and the way that the market works. And even if demand for food turns into food waste or ill health, food security politically is often interpreted to mean how can we keep the supply of food on a global basis fit for use in terms of filling the shelves and allowing consumers to buy whatever they want, whenever they want, and however much they want. Now, of course, these different definitions mean completely different things when you're thinking about agriculture production, and particularly in the UK environment. What does production in the UK have to do with food security, either globally or in the UK? Now, the bulk of food consumption on a global basis is underpinned by the production of only 8 major crops: maize, rice, wheat, barley, potatoes, sugarcane, and soy. And of course, many of these grains also underpin feed production from a animal-sourced foods perspective. Now, as we have found since the invasion of Ukraine, the energy market has fundamental flaws in it, in the sense that a small shortfall in production and supply from Russia in this case leads through marginal pricing to a very big energy cost rises. And, you know, I particularly feel irritated by this, because we have an energy supplier which is 100% renewable energy. So that's effectively, once you put in the capital, the energy supply is free. You know, you obviously have to pay back the capital, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the global market price of gas. And therefore, you know, one can feel aggrieved that I am paying for the increased energy prices that come from a shortfall in gas and oil on the global market. And it's the same with food, that because of marginal pricing, if there is a supply shortfall, global prices go up to match the most expensive way of filling up that shortfall. And it therefore follows from that that UK is such a small global producer that even if we doubled food production, it would have no impact on global prices, and therefore it wouldn't have much impact on the majority of foods that most people eat. And adding on top of that, certainly across Europe and the UK, so the EU 28, nowadays over 60% of grain goes into livestock feed in one way or another. And we did some calculations earlier in the year that if across Europe we ate 15% less chicken and pork, which tend to eat higher quality grains that could be repurposed for human consumption. So if people ate 15% less chicken and pork across Europe, that would have freed up the same quantity of grains that were stuck in Ukraine the interdiction of that supply, which led to the global food price spike. So food security in the sense of UK production and the sorts of things that we might grow has very little, food security in the strict sense, has very little to do with what we produce in the UK, and much more to do with the demand side, what people want to eat or what people are encouraged to eat. And moving on from that, I think everybody is aware that we face a global health crisis, that increasingly every country in the world suffers from some degree of undernutrition in the sense of lack of the right sorts of nutrients, and also overconsumption, particularly of calories and things that lead to obesity and the diseases associated with that. And so in the medical literature, nutrition literature, there's a lot of discussion about how do we encourage people to eat healthily, which is broadly a diversity of plants and plant proteins, more whole grains, less ultra-processed food and less livestock products. All of those contribute to a healthy diet. And were we in the UK to adopt a healthy diet, or were we globally to adopt a healthy diet, we would have to produce different things in different ways, but we wouldn't have to be on this treadmill of produce more, produce more, produce more, because the more we innovate, the more we produce, the more global prices go down, the more people overconsume, the more it's economically rational to waste food, the more it's easy to overeat food, and the more our health crisis gets worse. So the mapping of UK production to UK food security or to UK healthy diets, which is part of the strict sense of food security, is very, very weak indeed. So there is scope, of course, therefore, for thinking about how we restructure markets to deliver healthy diets, diversity of fruit and vegetables, more plant-based protein in an affordable way. And a lot of this comes down to things like global subsidy structure, the amount that we invest in research, how the markets work, you know, where are the incentives, where are the disincentives, you know, the sugar tax is a kind of nice example of where just changing price structure a little bit reduces some of the issues to do with overconsumption of calories. So we're ripe for a transformation in food. We need a transformation of food. The National Health Service is creaking. Globally, ill health from poor diets, particularly overeating, is the #1 mortality factor and the #1 underpinning causal factor of illness. So we're ripe for a food system transformation to eat differently. Now, coming on to biodiversity, of course, most people see biodiversity as a kind of nice to have, you know, curlews in the field or orangutans in rainforests in Malaysia, Sumatra and places like that. But of course, much deeper, biodiversity underpins a lot of our ability to live well in terms of mental health and physical health, particularly in the space of agriculture in terms of microbes and soil fertility, pollinators, natural enemies that reduce the need to put pesticides on the field, etc., etc. But I think more insidiously, the world, from an ecological perspective, if we weren't disturbing the world, natural communities have effectively evolved to be relatively stable, because if they don't, the community goes extinct and gets reassembled. And increasingly around the world, through particularly agriculture, we are disturbing ecosystems, and we're also driving ecosystem disturbance through climate change. Add these two things together, and you get what I call ecological rewiring, which is the fundamentals of the ecosystem get disturbed. And when that happens, you either get extinction or you get outbreaks as individual species escape their natural mechanisms of control, the things that normally eat them or the things that normally control them. And a nice example of this, although the science is not fully resolved, would be COVID, in the sense of land use change, our change with the way ecosystems work, the way the ecosystems work themselves, makes it much more likely for pests and pathogens to escape from their natural hosts and transfer to new hosts or to outbreak. So COVID was almost certainly made more likely by land use change and climate change. And that's the sort of example of things that biodiversity manages, whether it's agricultural pests, whether it's UG99 stem rust, or whether it is locusts in Africa and Asia, or whether it is things like zoonotic diseases. So the more we disturb biodiversity, the more these risks increase. And of course, biodiversity in itself plays an important role in resilience of the things that we want land to do, production of food in this case. It increases water holding potential, it increases carbon storage, it deals with climate change. You know, there are a lot of things that it does. So in the long run, human well-being absolutely crucially depends on biodiversity. So putting these kind of two elements together, do we need to protect UK production or expand UK production at the expense of biodiversity? And the answer, from a scientific perspective at least, is very clearly no, because the more we produce, the more negatives come from it. Yes, it does fit in with our current Prime Minister's growth agenda, in the sense that the more we produce, the more we can export, the more money that we can get into the system. But that shouldn't be at the expense of our long-term health and well-being. So just to sum up all of this, we do tend to think in agriculture that production is the most important thing. And as we presented in a recent Chatham House paper, that in itself depends on ideological assumptions about how markets work. And it's perfectly possible to imagine restructuring markets. You know, in Europe, they're restructuring energy markets to try and avoid the marginal pricing impacts of disruption. We could do the same with food in a way that would promote health in a better way, promote sustainability, and promote long-term systemic resilience. So we don't need to trade off production against biodiversity. What we need to do is think about how we can change the production, make it sustainable, conserve biodiversity, change the sorts of things we grow and the way we grow it in order to increase our health and well-being. And it's perfectly possible for farmers to make more income in a converted system, a transformed system, than they currently do. So to a certain extent, this trade-off is driven by ideological and market-led assumptions about how the world should work and how we can grow our economies within that. And if you set those aside, that trade-off disappears. Biodiversity is absolutely crucial to our long-term social and mental and physical well-being.
Hello, my name is Anne-Charlotte Mornington. I'm the head of impact at Olio, and I am going to tell you a little bit about our work and share a few prompts that hopefully will trigger some conversations amongst you. Starting by sharing my screen. So, what is Olio? Olio is a free app that enables the sharing of resources. How does it work? With Olio, we can allow individuals who have food or non-food items that they're not going to use to make them available to their local community, simply by taking a picture and submitting them on the app. This way, anyone in the local community who wishes to use those resources can message you, you arrange a pickup, they come collect it from you for free. It's a very simple way that allows resources to move amongst community so that they don't go underused. Olio is 7 years old, and we now have 6.2 million users globally. We have enabled sharing in 62 countries, and we're very proud of it. And we are definitely growing month on month at a very aggressive rate, which we're thrilled about. However, Olio operates in a very difficult climate. And the reason why Olio existed is because of a certain set of issues that I'm going to tell you about, which I hope will be good prompts for your later conversations. Food waste is an environmental tragedy of enormous scale. There's an estimated 1/3 to 50% of all food that is ever produced that goes uneaten, completely wasted. And along with that waste goes the water, the labor, the transportation, all of it goes to waste. In fact, it takes a landmass greater than China and Mongolia combined to grow food every single year that is never consumed. Why is food waste of such enormous scale? Secondly, food waste is an environmental catastrophe. When food is being sent to landfill, it rots and it produces methane. Methane is one of the most potent gas that exists. And in parallel to this, if food waste, in terms of global warming impact, if it was a country, it would rank just behind the US and China because it produces so much gas. The IPCC has identified that the number one thing that needs to be addressed to mitigate the worst impact of global warming is to reduce food waste. That goes before solar panels, before electric cars, and before many other solutions. Food waste is a really serious issue, yet so little is being done to address it. In parallel, food waste is also socially really unacceptable and makes no sense. Globally, over 800 million people go to bed hungry. That's 1 out of 9 people in the world. And while it's easy to think that this is an issue that only happens in the global south, it isn't. In the UK, an estimated 8 million people are food insecure, meaning that they don't know where their next meal is going to come from. 8 million people is roughly the population of London. And with the cost of living crisis, this is getting really out of hand. Why are so many people wasting food when so many others would do so well in having it? And if we look further afar, unfortunately, the prognostic doesn't get any better. There's an estimated 2.5 billion more people that will join the planet by 2050. And right now, it's not very clear how we're going to feed them, because if we keep on consuming at the rate that we do, we would have to increase our ability to produce food by 50%. And right now, we don't know how. But if only we stopped wasting food, so many people could be fed without needing to disrupt further resources, without needing to use more land to displace biodiversity or kill it effectively. A lot could be done just by reducing food waste. Why isn't this something that people are looking at any further? Is it better to produce more food and keep on wasting? So you can look at this with your glass half full or half empty. And it looks quite bleak with the data that I've shared with you. But on the positive side, in the UK, 60% of all food that is wasted is in the household. In fact, every household in the UK throws an estimated 800 pounds of food per year. So you could be the solution. Individuals could help address global warming significantly if only they stopped wasting food. Do you waste food? How can communities get more involved and take greater responsibility in the issue of global warming? That is the end of my presentation. I hope you found it thought triggering. Thank you very much for your time.
Hello, my name's Jonathan Napier and I work at Rothamsted Research, and I'm going to tell you about why I think using GM plants to make a sustainable source of omega-3 fish oils is a good and useful thing to do. So let me just share my screen and I'll just talk you through what we've been doing at Rothamsted for quite a number of years to develop a sustainable source of omega-3 fish oils. And really I'm going to focus on why we're doing this and why I think it's important. I'm not really going to get bogged down in the nuts and bolts of how we do it, because we've been doing it for so long. There's lots of technical details. To me, what's much more important and much more interesting is the why. Why are we doing it? And that's really what I'm going to spend a little bit of time trying to explain. So as you can see, the title of my talk is Making Fish Oils in Plants, and really that sums up my life's work for the last 25 years, trying to make fish oils in plants. Why am I trying to do this? Well, omega-3 fish oils, and I use the term omega-3 fish oils and omega-3 long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids sort of interchangeably. I'm talking specifically about a couple of fatty acids called EPA and DHA. They are omega-3 long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, but you only find them in fish oils. and they're beneficial for human health. They're a limited natural resource. They're predominantly found only in our oceans in the form of fish oils, and that is contrary to popular belief. There's not plenty more fish in the sea, and that's the challenge that we have, is how do you produce and sustain enough omega-3 fish oils to provide a fair and equitable share for everybody to have, because they are beneficial for human health, like I said. There is no known plant source available, so there is no plant source that makes naturally EPA or DHA. I'll show you that in a moment. And the critical use for omega-3 fish oils is actually in aquaculture, in fish farming. That's where the bulk of them are used, and I'll tell you about that in a moment as well. What's interesting about omega-3 long-chain POOFs, such as EPA and DHA, is that they have proven health benefits. We all hear and are told almost relentlessly of the health benefits of, you know, chemical X or nutrient Y or vitamin whatever, and actually in lots of cases the evidence for these things being beneficial is pretty sketchy. I mean, so when people are told we should have more antioxidants or things like this in our diet, there's not a huge amount of clinical evidence to back that up. In the case of omega-3 long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, EPA and DHA, there is really good evidence that they are health beneficial. They can reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease, which is a pandemic that is sweeping across the globe. There are more people suffering from diseases like CVD, type 2 diabetes, obesity, than there are people who are having insufficient calories. So these metabolic diseases, as a consequence of bad nutrition, are a scourge across the planet. And, you know, one way of reducing your risk of cardiovascular disease is having a diet that is high in omega-3 long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. But if those are scarce or in limit, where are you going to get those from? Because, as I said, the oceans are not an infinite resource that we can just carry on extracting from. And as I've already said, the problem is also that fish, that these omega-3 fatty acids, so omega-3 is just a classification of a type of fatty acid. It covers lots of different fatty acids, but the ones that give you the health benefits, which are, as I've said, EPA and DHA, these omega-3 long-chain polyunsaturates, they're only found in fish oils and some other marine organisms. They are not found in any plant. And I don't know whether you can see my pointer, but I'm pointing, if you look on the green side here, these are the fatty acid profiles of vegetable oils. And actually there are some omega-3 fatty acids present in some vegetable oils like linseed and some oilseed rape. There's in linseed, flax, actually there's quite a lot of omega-3. And people always say, oh, well, you know, why are you trying to do this? Don't you know that flax or linseed is rich in omega-3s? Actually, I did know that, but the problem is those omega-3s are not the ones that give you the health benefits. They're not the same as the omega-3s that you find in fish oil. So you can eat flax and linseed, it's not going to do you any harm, but it's not going to give you the health benefits of the fatty acids that you get from fish oils. Sounds pedantic, but it's a critical difference. That's why we're doing this, to try and, if you like, improve or enhance the omega-3s that you find naturally in plants, to make them something better, to make them into the long chain form, the EPA and DHA form that you find in fish oils and other marine organisms. And I've already said the primary reason that we're interested in this, and the primary demand for omega-3 fish oils, is not actually for direct human nutrition, which is sort of surprising given the important role they play in reducing your risk of cardiovascular disease. The vast bulk of all the omega-3s that get omega-3 fish oils that get extracted out of the oceans are used in fish farming, in aquaculture, in the production and in the nutrition of species like salmon, trout, sea bass, sea bream, tuna, etc. All of the marine species that are grown in aquaculture and fish farms have to be fed fish oils. And they have to be extracted from the oceans to feed the fish that are in the cage. So aquaculture has a challenge in that it needs to extract fish oils from the ocean to carry on working. Now, fish farming gets a terribly bad press, and people don't like the idea of fish oil, but if fish farming. But if you're going to eat animal protein, then fish is probably the most efficient way to produce animal protein compared to all other terrestrial systems. So if you look at the feed conversion ratios, farmed fish are much more efficient than any of the terrestrial production systems. But the challenge is this, is that the global population, we know this, is increasing all the time. So we've got more and more mouths to feed. How are we going to do that in a way that is acceptable to people? Because not everybody, you could argue we should all eat vegetarian or vegan diets, but most people don't want to do that. So you just have to accept that people don't want to do that. The problem is, as I've said, the amount of fish oil in the ocean is absolutely finite. So this the level of fish oil that's being extracted out of the ocean. It's about 1 million tons a year, and the bulk of that, at least 80% of that, goes to fish farming. This is the growth of aquaculture, which is where all the fish oil is being consumed. And you can see this is the green is aquaculture. Aquaculture is completely booming now. And so that's what's gobbling up more and more of the fish oil that we take out of our ocean. All the fish that you buy in the supermarket, the salmon, the trout, the sea bass, the sea bream, all of these species that you buy and you're used to eating, all of that's farmed. Actually, there's a very good argument that actually the farming is probably a more sustainable and a more effective way of producing the fish than wild capture, when you think about the impact on the environment of sending fleets of boats out into the ocean. So anyway, there's a big problem though with aquaculture, like I said, has had bad press, and it's trying to become more sustainable. And one of the drivers for getting more sustainable was reducing its reliance on omega-3 fish oils caught from the oceans. So that was something that they've been trying to do, and this is shown on this graph here. So 30 years ago, all of the diets that were fed to fish were exclusively marine. So the marine oils and marine protein, basically they caught fish, little small fish like anchovies and things like this were sort of ground up and fed to the fish, and that was the diet the fish had. That was when aquaculture was quite a small industry. Now it's a massive industry, and it has sensitivity towards sustainability. The problem is that there are not enough fish in the ocean to do that. And so aquaculture has now been substituting vegetable oils and vegetable protein for the marine protein and the marine oils that it was using previously. And this is what's shown on this bar chart here. Green indicates substitution with plant protein or plant oil. You might imagine this is a good thing, because it's going to be more sustainable, because you can grow plants in a much more, you can grow them year and year. You can sort of replenish stocks in a way that you can't with fish stocks. But the problem is that the fish, and we showed you on the previous slide, the plant oils don't contain EPA and DHA in the same way as the fish oils do. And this is what's shown here in this graph here, is that as these diets became more sustainable with more vegetable components, actually what happened was the EPA and DHA levels went down in the salmon fillet. So this is just basically the salmon fillet that you buy in the supermarket. And what happened was that fillet basically had half of the EPA and DHA. So these are the health beneficial fatty acids. These are the things that are going to reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. These are the USPs, if you like, of fish, of oily fish. It's been reduced by half. And I don't think the consumer was told about this. But so that just is a snapshot of why it's really important to have new sustainable sources of omega-3s, especially to support aquaculture, because aquaculture is going to be a critical component of feeding people in the coming decades. It is a key plank in, if you like, reorganizing our diet to be less dependent on terrestrial animal protein and more dependent on plant-based protein, but we also need to increase our increase of omega-3s. So just to sum up quickly, is how do you make, if you need to make a new source of omega-3 long-chain PUFAs, how would you do this? And this is the idea we had 25 years ago, was we can just use genetic engineering, GM, to make a plant that makes omega-3 long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. And it was deceptively simple. You just take the genes, to make those fatty acids. And actually, although we talk about them being omega-3 fish oils, it's not the fish that make these fatty acids, it's the marine microbes, it's the algae, the plankton, the little unicellular organisms shown here, these beautiful little things. They've got the genes in them to make EPA and DHA. They're at the base of the food web in the oceans. They're making the fatty acids, and those fatty acids accumulate all the way up through the food webs. So if you just find the genes, put those genes in plants, and then the plants could make omega-3 fatty acids. And that was the idea we had in 1996. And the fact that I'm still talking about it now tells you that it wasn't as easy as we thought it was going to be, at least from a technical challenge point of view. But actually, we've got it to work. And we've got it to work in a way that we can now make EPA and DHA. Just focus on these two comparator in the box here. This is the level of EPA and DHA that you'd find in a fish oil. So this is what we're trying to compete with. And this is our GM camelina seed oil. So we're just making these fatty acids in the seeds, in the oil of our GM plant. And we're using camelina because it's a cousin of oilseed rape, but it doesn't outcross with those species. And all you need to take away from this slide is that you're looking at these slices of in the pie chart, the levels of EPA and DHA in fish oil and our camelina soy are pretty much the same. So we can replicate what you find in a natural fish oil in our plant. The difference is we're growing these in a field. We're not taking them out of the ocean. And, you know, I think that means that, you know, that we can do something really great. And, you know, some of the, you know, coverage of our work that we've done. So we've done quite a lot on this, you know, and we've demonstrated that it works in the real world. This is some coverage from when we've done both growing the plants in the real world in the field, so doing GM field trials, and then also doing salmon feeding trials. So we're actually extracting the oil from our GM plants and feeding them to salmon and showing that the plant-derived oil is a complete replacement for the equivalent oceanically sourced fish oil. This is just a timeline of the many things that we've done. So we've done, you know, lots of GM field trials, lots of aquafeed trials. We've done human feeding trials. You know, so we've grown the crops in many different environments. So this has moved much further than most academic research projects, and we're now at a position where this technology could be used to actually deliver the sort of benefits that I had mentioned at the start of my talk. But, you know, all of these things take time. I mean, and anybody who thinks that these things can be delivered in a short period of time doesn't really understand agriculture, because agriculture takes time. And, you know, it's always taken time. You know, and this is for where we are now, the challenges that we've got. Because we have a prototype, we've got a plant that makes EPA and DHA, and we know it works. So we're sort of here, we know this works, that grows in the field, we know it works in terms of feeding the fish. We just need to move on this pathway here to get this past the research and development phase into the market phase. But of course, there's many things to overcome, like GM regulation, business development, commercialization, and all of these are the things that universities, academic environments talk about and as aspirational and things that we should do, but actually realistically don't really know how very well to do that. So that in itself becomes a challenge. And of course, you know, and this is my last slide, but it's certainly not to suggest this is the least important thing. You also have to think about social license and consumer acceptance, because there's no point in developing this technology if nobody's going to accept it. And that's why we've spent a lot of time talking about what we do and explaining the why rather than the nuts and bolts and the how. You know, a key question for the public can be brutally said is, you know, what's in it for me? And if you can explain what's in it for me, well, actually, this is a sustainable source of health-giving oils that can reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease and also reduce the environmental footprint of aquaculture and fish farming, then maybe that's something that people would find more acceptable than saying, well, but there's nothing in it for you. So that's really it. Thank you for your attention. I hope all of that's clear, and I'd be happy to take people's questions if they want to drop me an email. Okay, thanks very much for your attention. Bye.
Hello everyone. I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person, but I've been asked by Matt to be provocative and to be provocative about the debate around food security and nature recovery. So take this in the spirit it's intended of provocation. I'm going to talk about 3 areas briefly of what I consider to be sloppy thinking in the current debates and discourse, and particularly over the last 2 or 3 years. So the first one is about sloppiness of thinking about farming systems. There was a time, and it wasn't that long ago, 5-10 years ago, when there was some quite good definitions really around farming systems. There was organic, there was definitely integrated, associated with leaf and the leaf mark, with some good definitions, very clear definitions for organic around certification, and conventional in a sense was the rest, but conventional was on a journey. But farming systems was a fairly well-defined territory. That has changed dramatically in the last few years. And what has been sloppy about it is the introduction of new terms. Agroecological. Is that the sort of Trojan horse to bring in organic without actually calling it organic? That's a possibility I think we should consider. The other one is the ubiquitous term regenerative agriculture. When you actually unpack what is being talked about for regenerative agriculture, an awful lot of it is associated with actually things we were talking about when we were talking about sustainable intensification and integrated farming systems. We're talking about cover crops, we're talking about legumes, mint hill. I think regenerative agriculture has sort of, forgive the pun, muddied the field rather. So we need to get back to some good definitions. I certainly think we need to think long and hard over too readily rushing down the agroecological route, particularly as associated with the agroecological route is a disdain for technology quite often, certainly a disdain for gene editing. And I think we need, if we're going to feed the world, feed the people in this country, and do so in a way that actually safeguards land for other purposes, particularly nature recovery, then we have to look very, very seriously at high tech and particularly gene editing in mainstream agriculture. And gene editing can go a long way towards helping us reduce our dependency on pesticides and fertilizers. So my first sloppiness that I'm provoking with is around terms like agroecological and regenerative farming. Let's get back to some good definitions. Let's talk about integrated farming systems, organic, both of which have a real role to play. My second area of sloppiness is around scale. And here I'm thinking particularly of multifunctional agriculture and the sort of assumption that everybody has, we have to have multifunctional land use. Well, what on earth does that mean? It's without defining at what scale, and people very rarely do. And of course, the proponents of agroecological agriculture tend to see inherent in that as multifunctionality at a farm level, at a field level, and yet in reality, even agroecological or organic agriculture is not multifunctional in the middle of the field. That is devoted to crop production, and I think we have to think long and hard about what we mean by multifunctional land use. Rather, we should be talking, in my view, of multifunctional landscapes, and those landscapes are defined by other hydrological and geomorphological, and soil, etc. So yes to multifunctional landscapes, where we decide at a landscape scale what kind of land use is appropriate. But let's pretend that every patch of land, every farm, every holding can somehow produce everything, because it clearly can't. And I think multifunctionality, which started off, I think, as a really good idea, ended up actually being not a particularly helpful idea in many ways. So the third area of sloppiness, well, this is, I think, really when people talk about food security when really they're talking about levels of self-sufficiency. and automatically increasing our self-sufficiency. Now that might be a good thing to do for other reasons, particularly in a geopolitical context, but it is not per se to do with food security broadly defined. When we talk about food security, we have to talk about nutrition, we have to talk about diet, we have to talk about waste, we have to talk about fairness in socioeconomic and equity terms. And if we start talking about all of those things, and if we do so in the context of a wider sense of land use and landscape, then I think when we talk about food security, we really move very rapidly to health security. And we see how land is part of the answer for feeding people, but is also part of the answer for health and well-being as well. So it's a much broader debate than just levels of self-sufficiency. So those are my three areas of what I consider at times to be sloppy thinking. I hope they have provoked you. I hope they provoke some discussion and probably some disagreement in that discussion. I've just realised that one term I did not mention was land sparing, which I think I ought to just throw in, because land sharing is often associated with multifunctionality and is seen as automatically a good thing. And yet there is a lot of scientific evidence that land sparing, particularly for nature conservation, is a rather good idea. So you actually have areas that are devoted to nature recovery. That's the end of my little provocation. Thank you.